Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a research assistant professor of field crop entomology. Today we'll be talking about the Dectes stem borer. This is an insect that has been with us for some time, but we've been paying more attention to in southern Illinois in recent years. We seem to be finding more of this insect as time goes on. I want to just talk a little bit about the biology of Dectes stem borer as well as how to manage this pest in soybean in Illinois. Now, as the name suggests, the larva of the Dectes stem borer bores inside of soybean stems. And if you're not used to seeing this, the first time you see this sort of damage, it can be pretty concerning, pretty scary. Now, as we'll talk about throughout this presentation, this is probably looks a little bit worse than it actually is, but there are some other concerns that we have with stem borer and with how to protect our soybeans from yield losses caused by this pest. In terms of the life cycle of Dectes stem borer, they go through one generation per year. The adults tend to emerge beginning in July and throughout August in Illinois. That's a relatively long period of activity for the adults, and they have a relatively long period of egg-laying activity. Now, the adult female is going to lay her egg into the petiole of the soybean plant. That egg is going to hatch, and the larva will bore into that petiole and begin feeding on the pith within the petiole. Now, that's going to ultimately cause that petiole to wilt and die, and that wilting of the petioles is often the first sign that you have a Dectes infestation in your field. The larvae, again, continue to feed on the pith and bore into the main stem of the soybean plant, and that's where you get that rather ugly damage that I showed you in the earlier slide. Now, towards the end of the season, they'll actually overwinter as a partially grown larva. They're going to overwinter in the base of the soybean stem. When they do that, they actually girdle the stem, and that can cause lodging. And that's really, when we talk about potential damage from stem borer, that's the damage that we want to avoid, and that's the damage that can actually cause yield losses. And you can see an example of that here in a patch of a soybean field. This looks really bad, but even severe levels of this stalk tunneling not seem to impact yield. They have little, if any, effect on yield. My colleagues have been able to confirm that by actually excluding larvae from the stems and comparing heavily infested stems with uninfested plants and finding no difference in yield between those two. Again, this surprises a lot of people when they see it based on the appearance of these plants, but the reality is that stalk tunneling generally does not impact yield. And you can see what this stalk tunneling looks like here at harvest towards the end of the season. It's still very recognizable when the stems are mature. Again, where we're worried about this insect is where you have the potential to cause lodging. So these larvae are going to overwinter in the base of the stem. When they do that, they'll actually girdle that soybean stem from the inside. They'll plug it with sawdust, and that causes a nice little cavity to form where they can spend the winter. Now, of course, the consequence of this is it weakens the stem, and that stem can fall down, and you get these stems that have fallen off, and they have this kind of a neat cut right above that frass plug. And if you look down into the stem from above, as you can see in the yellow circle there, you will actually see that plug. The initial signs of infestation by Dectes stem borer, you're going to have these petioles wilting and dying and breaking off. That's your first sign that you have an infestation, and that's what you can use ultimately to identify infested fields early on. Towards the end of the season, where you have girdling occurring in your field, you'll actually get this little pile of sawdust on the outside of those stems that have been girdled. Now, when you see a good deal of this, that's a pretty good indication that you have some girdling going on in your field and that you might have the potential for lodging in that field. And so this is a good way to identify those fields that are pretty close to potentially having some lodging issues that maybe you should try to prioritize harvesting and getting them out of the field as soon as possible. In terms of overall management of Dectes stem borer, we generally don't recommend chemical control. It's possible to get some control of the adults. The larvae, as you might imagine, being concealed inside of the soybean stem, are going to be impossible to control once they're already there. So you can target the adults with a chemical insecticide, but it takes repeated applications over a relatively long period of time. You're not going to be able to get economical control of this insect. In addition to that, it's difficult to predict lodging potential during this period. There's not a real direct relationship between adult populations and the potential for lodging, which has to do especially with how long those soybean plants are left out in the field. And that's what our management really needs to focus on, is preventing or managing the lodging. Remember that larval tunneling in and of itself has little, if any, effect on yield. It's the lodging that can cause damage when we have Dectes stem borer infestations. So in terms of the management, we want to monitor those infested fields, again, by looking for those broken off petioles, the wilted petioles. We want to split stems as we get into R5 and R6 and look for those larvae. One nice thing about these larvae, you're not going to confuse that with anything else. If you split a stalk open, there's no other insect in Illinois that's going to cause damage that really resembles Dectes stem borer in any way. Finally, your last warning side at the end of the season is that sawdust at the base of girdled stems. And if you have fields that have a high level or a high proportion of the plants that have those sawdust piles at the base, those are fields that might have a high probability of lodging at the end of the season. Those are fields that you want to prioritize to get out of the field. And ultimately, the best management is going to be a timely harvest. Now, if we had our way, if we got our choice, we would harvest every soybean field in Illinois in a timely manner every year. No one wants to leave their soybeans out there longer than they have to. We can't control the weather. What we can do is prioritize those fields that we identify as having a heavy Dectes stem borer infestation for harvest. Get those out of the field first as early as we can, and that will help to minimize these instances of lodging. And if we can avoid the lodging that comes along with the pest, we'll avoid yield losses. So even though the stem tunneling and the damage that they cause can look ugly, this is an insect that we can deal with and have really minimal impacts on our overall yield and profitability in soybean.